Welcome to my lecture on Chapter 17, Part 1, where we're going to start learning about the urinary system. The learning objectives for this unit are, by the time you're done reading the chapter, listening to the lecture, and using all of the available resources, you will be expected to identify the parts of the urinary system, explain the general functions of the urinary system, explain the relationships of the urinary system to the endocrine and the circulatory system, and describe the function and structure of the nephron. Also, you should be able to compare urinary system of the male with the female urinary system, identify the constituents of urine, and differentiate processes of secretion, filtration, and reabsorption, and where they occur in the nephron. With all the metabolic activity that goes on in our bodies, the body creates a lot of waste material that has to be removed. The urinary system acts as a purification plant, cleaning most of this waste out of the blood and helping the body to get rid of it. The urinary system controls our electrolyte and fluid balances. It filters our blood, reabsorbs and secretes ions, and produces urine. Without this very important function, you wouldn't live very long at all. The urinary system consists of two kidneys that are bean-shaped organs that are found in the superior dorsal abdominal cavity, and these organs are the organs that filter blood and make urine. The urinary system uses accessory structures such as the ureter, which is a tube that carries the urine from the kidney down to the urinary bladder that's located in the inferior ventral pelvic cavity. Another accessory structure that's part of the renal system is the urinary bladder. The bladder is basically an expandable sac that has one urethra, that is the tube, on the lower end of the bladder that transports urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. The job of the urinary system is to make urine, thereby controlling the body's fluid and electrolyte balance and eliminating waste products. When the kidneys make urine, it has to go through three processes in order for urine to be created. Filtration is the process that filters the blood. This determines what passes through the filter, and what does pass through the filter is a substance that's called filtrate. Reabsorption is the process that selects substances that are needed to stay in the body after it's removed from the urine. Secretion is the last process in the production of urine. Secretion is a step in which substances move from the bloodstream and leave the body in the urine. Figure 17-1 from page 433 of your textbook is a figure that illustrates the anatomy of the urinary system. In this figure you see the kidneys, the ureters and the bladder, and the urethra shown, and there are boxes on the right side of the figure identifying each of these structures. The kidneys produce the urine and help regulate body fluids. The ureter transports urine to the bladder. The urinary bladder serves as a reservoir for the urine, and the urethra is the tube that conveys urine to the exterior of the body. Now we're going to take a more detailed look at the kidneys. The kidney is covered by a fibrous layer of tissue that's connective tissue. This layer is referred to as the renal capsule. The part that gives the kidney its bean shape is that part of the kidney that's called the renal hilum. At the hilum, the arteries that bring blood to the kidneys are found. Also, the veins that take filtered blood away are found, as well as the ureter that is attached at the hilum that takes urine away from the kidney and down to the bladder. When examining the internal structure of the kidney, we find that the kidney can be divided into three layers. The outer layer is called the renal cortex, and this is where blood filtration takes place. The renal medulla is the middle layer, and this layer contains a number of those triangle-shaped structures. They're striped areas called renal pyramids, and these are composed of collecting tubules for the urine that is made in the kidney. The third and innermost layer of the kidney is the renal pelvis, and this structure is shaped like a funnel and divided into 2 or 3 large collecting cups that are called major calyces. Each major calyx is divided into several minor calyces that form a series of cups around the tips of the pyramids. As blood flows through the kidney, it's filtered by millions of tiny filters found in the cortex. The filtrate flows through tiny tubes in the medulla and collects in the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis, which is an enlarged proximal portion of the ureter, empties into the ureter, where urine is then carried down to the bladder. Figure 17-2 that comes from page 434 of your textbook shows a sagittal view through the kidney. This figure is titled The Internal and External Anatomy of the Kidney. And if you look at this, you'll find that the kidney is indeed shaped like a bean. The outer layer is called the renal capsule. Inside the capsule, you'll find the layer that's referred to as the cortex. Next, you'll find the renal medulla, which is where you'll find the little pyramid structures that were mentioned before. These little structures drain into a common drainage area that is called the minor and major calyces. Urine then follows the drainage system and goes out through the ureter at the base of the kidney. That little depressed area that's in the side of the kidney is referred to as that hilum, and that's where the blood vessels and the ureter connect up to the kidney. You'll see there also that there's a renal artery that takes blood to the kidney and a renal vein that takes blood away. In order for the renal system to work properly, it has to have a very good supply of blood. The single renal artery that enters each kidney at the hilum branches into 5 smaller or segmental arteries. Each of these segmental arteries then branch into smaller vessels that are called lobar arteries in the renal sinus. The functional unit in the kidney is called the nephron. The nephron consists of millions of microscopic funnels and tubes. The nephron can be divided into 2 distinct parts: the renal corpuscle, which is a filter, and the renal tubule is where reabsorption and secretion are done. As I'm talking about this slide, you might find it helpful to turn to page 436 in your textbook and look at figure 17-4. Blood enters the renal corpuscle by way of a structure called the glomerulus, which is really a ball of capillaries. Surrounding the glomerulus is a double-layered membrane that's called the glomerular capsule, or another more common name is the Bowman's capsule. As blood flows into the glomerulus, everything except blood cells and a few large molecules that are mainly protein are pushed through the capillaries across the filter and into the glomerular capsule. The material that's filtered out of the blood into the glomerular capsule is called the glomerular filtrate. If blood or protein leaks into the urine, this can indicate a kidney filtration problem. On this slide, you do see figure 17-4 that gives us a graphical image of the nephron. The medical illustrator takes a sample of structure out of the kidney on the upper left-hand corner to greatly magnify the structure that's shown on the right portion of this figure. In this figure, you see the renal corpuscle that's made up of the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. As blood arrives at this level in the kidney, the blood enters the kidney through the artery that's called the arcuate artery. Blood flows through this, passes through the little afferent arteriole to a collection of arteries in the glomerulus where filtration takes place. The blood and other substances that are not filtered out exit the glomerular capillaries and resume flowing through the efferent arteries and continue their journey through the blood vessels and end up going back out by way of the arcuate vein. The substances that get filtered out begin their journey through the proximal tubule, and different things happen to the filtrate at various places along the way through this convoluted tubing that we'll be talking about very soon. Ultimately, what's left after it's made its journey through all of this tubing ends up flowing down to the collecting ducts and then out and down to the bladder. Beyond the glomerular capsule, the rest of the nephron is a series of tubes that are referred to as renal tubules. Glomerular filtrate travels from the glomerular capsule into the first part of the renal tubule that is called the proximal tubule. Once the filtrate has made its way through the proximal tubule, the glomerular filtrate then flows into the nephron loop, otherwise known as the loop of Henle. This loop is consisted of the descending loop, similar in structure to the proximal tubule, and the ascending loop. The next part of the journey after it gets through the nephron loop is the distal tubule. The wall of the distal tubule is similar to that of the ascending branch of the nephron loop. From the distal tubule, then, the glomerular filtrate flows into one of several collecting ducts. The filtrate then continues through the series of collecting ducts to arrive at the minor calyces and then on to the major calyces, finally then to the renal pelvis and to the ureter. At this point, the glomerular filtrate is considered to be urine. Figure 17-5 that comes from page 437 of your textbook is very similar to what you saw in the previous figure. It is slightly bigger and it gives you a little more detail about what happens in each of the different places in the functional renal unit. One of the differences here is that it points out on the figure what happens at the various places along the way as the filtrate makes its journey through the renal unit. If you look at the Bowman's capsule, where the glomerulus allows blood to circulate through, at the very beginning when the filtrate crosses over and gets into Bowman's space, you see that water, urea, uric acid, and glucose, along with some amino acids and salts, are filtered out at this point. Not far from that place, along the renal tubules, you see that amino acids and salts are brought back into the blood vessels, so those are saved. They don't go out into the urine. Also at this point, water can be reabsorbed back into the vascular system. And as the filtrate continues its journey along the renal tubules, you'll see that when it finally makes its way over to the distal tubule, hydrogen ions can come out, as well as ammonia. And further along, you see that the water, salts, urea, uric acid, and ammonia are excreted out into the urine. Once again, if you refer to page 437, and again at that figure 17-5, you can see that the blood vessels in this area, around the renal tubule, are very close in proximity to the nephrons, because the substances that are removed or retrieved from the renal tubules don't have to travel very far in order to make that journey. Blood approaches the nephron by way of the afferent arterioles. Blood flows from the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, and then blood flows from the glomerulus by way of the efferent arterioles into the capillaries that are called peritubular capillaries, and the structure that's called the vasa recta. The system of blood vessels and renal tubules are in close proximity to one another because the substances have to move between the tubules and the bloodstream. These surrounding blood vessels allow for reabsorption and secretion of certain substances. Blood leaves the nephron by way of the vessel that's called the cortical radiate veins. With all of this blood filtration, reabsorption, and secretion going on, it's not hard to understand that the kidney has to have a good blood supply. The kidneys are well vascularized. Each nephron is surrounded by blood vessels, and the flow of blood is controlled by the vessel that's called the afferent arteriole. When blood flow decreases for a period of time, such as during times after trauma or sudden illness that's very bad, oxygen delivery to the nephron decreases, and if it's bad enough, it can result in damage for lack of oxygen, and we call that kind of damage ischemia. After a severe traumatic experience, blood flow can be decreased by any number of different hormonal mechanisms that cause prolonged periods of vasoconstriction, thus restricting blood flow, and this is not uncommon in cases where you have severe blood loss. In situations that continue long enough, the tissues can become ischemic and eventually die, and this can result in kidney failure that can either be temporary or permanent. Remember, one of the major roles of kidneys are to control fluid and electrolyte balance in the body. This is achieved by controlling the urine volume and the composition. In order for the urine to be formed, the nephron must perform three processes: glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. If you remember, back in the glomerulus, when filtration takes place there, fluid and molecules pass from the glomerular capillaries into the glomerular capsule. This crosses over the filter that's made up of the walls of the capillaries and the podocytes of the glomerular capsule. Filtrate flows into the renal tubule at that point, where the chemistry is controlled by reabsorption and secretion. Filtration moves fluid and chemicals into the nephron from the blood. The glomerular filtrate chemistry is similar to that of blood. That final product of this process, called urine, is chemically different from plasma because of the processes of reabsorption and secretion, which control the concentration of the various chemicals and the volume of urine. Substances that get reabsorbed pass from the renal tubule back into the peritubular capillaries and end up getting returned back to the circulation. Substances that get secreted pass through the peritubular capillaries and into the renal tubules, where they will eventually leave the body as part of the urine. Some substances, like glucose, are completely reabsorbed, so they are not lost through the urine. They're brought back into circulation, while substances like metabolic waste products, urea and creatinine are a couple of good examples, are almost completely secreted into the urine so that your body can get rid of those waste products. Figure 17-6 from page 439 of your textbook is a very abbreviated diagram that focuses on the processes that are involved in urine formation. The key that's found to the left of the figure indicates that the processes that are filtration are represented in the very pale green color arrow, and they are labeled with A. The reabsorption process is labeled B and is represented by the red arrow, and secretion is represented by the letter C and is represented by the darker teal colored arrow. So if you look at this figure, and you may need to look at it in your textbook, you can see that the secretion takes place from the glomerular capillaries across into the renal tubules at the top of the glomerular capsule. As the pre-urine travels down this tube, you get to the next place that's labeled B, where you see the red arrow, and this represents reabsorption of substances from the pre-urine back into the peritubular circulation. And then finally, just before the urine is done, you see secretion there at letter C, where the body has an opportunity to get rid of waste products before the urine is completed and goes down to the bladder. Figure 17-1, found on page 439 of your textbook, is a table that breaks down the kidney fluid chemistry. The first column is labeled substance, the second plasma, the third glomerular filtrate, and the last column is labeled urine. The substances that are listed here are protein, glucose, sodium, potassium, urea, and creatinine. Two of these things that I want to point out to you are the protein and the glucose. If you look at this, you'll see that none of protein, no glucose, are released in the urine of a normally functioning kidney. There's some sodium, potassium, and urea and creatinine, and all of these will vary depending upon the kinds of things you are consuming and your electrolyte balance. But it's very important to recognize that under normal circumstances, you do not lose protein or glucose from your urine. The process of filtration is controlled by several different factors. Of course, the filter size is important because it determines what particles can get through the filter. Podocytes and capillary walls of the renal corpuscle create a filter that has fixed openings. Things like plasma and many of the substances that are dissolved in plasma are capable of passing through the filter, but large structures like blood cells, platelets, protein can't get through the healthy kidney if the filters are working properly. In addition to the filter size, another factor that controls filtration is the pressure being exerted on the blood as it passes through the kidney. The higher the pressure is on one side in relationship to the other is what enables filtration to take place. This allows chemicals to be pushed through the filter more quickly. Higher blood pressure in the glomerular capillaries increases the filtration, while lower pressure decreases filtration. Figure 17-7 from page 440 of your textbook is a figure that illustrates the concepts behind filter selectivity. Your textbook likes to use a concept of the different size screen mesh that you can use on your windows and doors. The finer the mesh, the smaller particles that are going to be trapped by this screen and not allowed to pass through. So if you have pores or openings in the filter that are so small that they won't allow certain things to pass through, then that is keeping those things from being allowed to pass. Those might be examples of things like red blood cells and proteins that are kept from being put out into the filtrate. Things that are a smaller size are allowed to pass through. Figure 17-8 that comes from page 441 of your textbook shows a side-by-side comparison of a damaged kidney and a healthy kidney. And I think it's pretty obvious that there's something terribly wrong with the kidney that's on the left. A moment ago I mentioned that one of the things that helps to control the filtration is blood pressure. The body has a way of protecting the kidneys from minor changes in the systolic pressure, so that under minor changes the rate and pressure don't change. And this protection mechanism is called autoregulation. And as systemic pressure increases, the afferent arterioles that lead into the glomerulus constrict, decreasing the amount of blood that's allowed to get into the glomerulus. The body does have a way of overriding this autoregulation. Since the kidney regulates fluid volume, the kidney can work with the cardiovascular system to regulate the blood pressure. The glomerular filtration can be decreased to conserve fluid when the blood pressure falls, or it can increase filtration if the blood pressure rises. The sympathetic nervous system can control urine production by causing the secretion of hormones from the adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine. If you remember, when we were back in the chapter on the nervous system, we learned that the sympathetic nervous system and these hormones decrease urine production. So, under emergency circumstances, these hormones play a role in controlling the urine output. We especially see this kind of effect when patients are badly injured and the blood flow to the kidneys is being sacrificed because there's an overall decrease in blood volume in the body. So the processes of tubular reabsorption and secretion control the chemistry and the volume of our urine. The substances that are reabsorbed move from the tubules back into the bloodstream by way of the peritubular capillaries, and this is the way things are saved to stay in the blood. The substances that are secreted stay in the tubule and will eventually go out of the body in the urine. Remember that if anything affects the reabsorption and the secretion, has an effect on the urine chemistry. The first thing that affects the absorption and secretion in the tubules is the tubule permeability, and that means the size of the pores that enable particles or substances to cross from one side to the other. Each section of tubule can reabsorb and secrete different substances. Molecules move across the membranes through several different methods, including some of those methods that we've studied in previous chapters: diffusion and active transport. The differences in tubular permeability result in very different areas in which molecules can be reabsorbed or secreted in each part of the tubule. Table 17-2 from page 444 of your textbook is a table that illustrates the individual functions of the tubules. The first column is titled Tubule. The second column is titled Substances that are reabsorbed or secreted. I think this is helpful information that you could spend time on as you're studying and preparing for the next exam. One of the problems that can develop in kidneys are kidney stones. There's still a pretty good mystery around why stones form, but when they do, there are substances in the stones that are crystallized urine that are in the tubule, often because the concentration of the molecule is abnormally high. Through research on kidney stones, it's been found that stones can be made of substances such as calcium and uric acid. Sometimes they can be attributed to the effects of kidney infections. Some people are more susceptible than others to developing stones. Some stones are so small that people are able to pass them unnoticed, while others have stones that are larger or irregularly shaped so that they can become lodged in the tubule, obstructing the flow of fluid through them and causing irritation to nearby tissues. The symptoms that come along with kidney stones are blood in the urine, severe flank pain. Stones may move on their own. Others may need to be treated with increased fluid intake. There are some other methods that can be used to treat kidney stones. The method called lithotripsy actually shoots shock waves to break the stone up into smaller particles, or surgery may be required. When patients are in the process of being treated for kidney stones, they're often asked to filter their urine through fabrics such as cheesecloth to catch the stones to help determine whether they've been successful at passing the stones. Figure 17-9 on page 445 of your textbook is an illustration that shows you the sites of tubular reabsorption and secretion. I like this illustration because it gives us a good idea of showing us just where in this long tubing that various substances are either reabsorbed back from the tubules into the bloodstream, and those things that are gotten rid of from the blood and sent over to the tubules for excretion. And you'll notice that glucose is completely reabsorbed and returned to the circulation in the proximal convoluted tubule. Water is reabsorbed at a couple of different places, and sodium can be reabsorbed at different places along the way. Potassium can be excreted at different places. So this is an example of the way that the body is able to tweak the fluid to make sure that just the right amount of different electrolytes are kept by the body, and waste products that are needed to be disposed of are brought into the tubules and are then sent on to be disposed of out of the body. This ends part 1 of my lecture on chapter 17. Stay tuned for part 2.